Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. Somchai never believed in ghosts until the night he found his own name written in the morgue logbook in handwriting that wasn't his, time-stamped 3 hours after he'd locked the doors and gone home. He stared at the entry under the dim fluorescent light, his thumb smudging the ink to see if it was fresh. It was. The pen sat exactly where he'd left it that morning, but the letters were sharper, more deliberate than his usual scrawl. The entry read, Subject 23 moved to drawer 8, signed with his initials and dated for 2:17 in the morning. He'd left at 11:30. He was certain of that because he'd checked his phone twice on the walk to the bus stop, anxious to get home before the last train. Now, standing alone in the records room with the air conditioning rattling overhead, he felt the weight of something watching him from the hallway that led to the cold chamber. Somchai had taken the night shift job at Siriraj Hospital's forensic morgue 3 weeks earlier, desperate for the extra cash to cover his final year of medical school tuition. The hospital was Bangkok's oldest, a sprawling complex of colonial-era buildings wedged along the Chao Phraya River, and the morgue occupied the basement of a structure that dated back to the 1880s. The pay was better than anything else available to students, nearly double what he'd make tutoring or working at a clinic, but everyone knew why. No one wanted to spend their nights alone with the dead, especially not in a place with a reputation like Siriraj. The older staff spoke in hushed tones about the unclaimed bodies, the ones that stayed in the drawers for months, because no family ever came forward, their spirits restless and angry at being forgotten. Somchai had laughed it off during his orientation, nodding politely while the day shift supervisor, an older woman named Niran, explained the importance of keeping the logbook updated and never, under any circumstances, leaving a drawer open overnight. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between pity and warning, and told him that if he heard anything unusual, he should ignore it. Just ignore it, she'd said, and finish your shift. Don't go looking for explanations. He'd thanked her, pocketed his key card, and showed up that first night feeling confident, even a little smug. He was a medical student. He'd dissected cadavers. He understood death as a biological process, nothing more. The superstitions were for people who didn't know better, people who let fear cloud their thinking. But after 3 weeks of working alone in the morgue's cold, antiseptic silence, he was starting to understand why the previous night shift worker had quit without giving notice. The first strange thing happened on his 4th shift, though he didn't recognize it as strange at the time. He'd been sitting at the desk near the entrance, reviewing his pharmacology notes between rounds, when he heard a soft thud from deeper in the building. It was the kind of sound that could have been anything, a door settling, something falling in another room, but it made him look up. The morgue was arranged in a series of connected chambers, the main corridor lined with metal drawers built into the walls, each one holding a body in cold storage. At the far end was the examination room, and beyond that, a smaller storage area for personal effects and unclaimed belongings. The sound had come from that direction. He'd marked his page, stood up, and walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps echoing off the tile. The overhead lights buzzed, faintly, casting everything in a pale, clinical glow that made the shadows in the corners seem darker by contrast. When he reached the examination room, he found nothing out of place. The steel tables were empty and spotless. The instruments hung neatly on their hooks, the air thick with the smell of formaldehyde and disinfectant. He checked the storage room, saw only the rows of labeled boxes and plastic bags, and returned to his desk feeling foolish. It was an old building. Things made noise. That was all. But when he sat down, he noticed that his pen had rolled off the desk and onto the floor, even though he was certain he'd left it clipped to his notebook. He picked it up, frowned, and went back to studying. The sounds continued over the next week, always faint, always just distant enough that he could convince himself he'd imagined them. A scrape of metal against metal. A soft exhalation, like air escaping from a tire. Once, what sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the corridor when he was in the records room, filing paperwork. Each time, he would stop what he was doing, listen carefully, and hear nothing but the hum of refrigeration units and the distant rumble of traffic from the street above. He started wearing earbuds during his shifts, playing music low enough that he could still hear the door if someone came in, but loud enough to drown out the small, unidentifiable noises that made his skin prickle. It helped, mostly. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that the isolation and the late hours were playing tricks on his mind, that he'd adjust soon enough. But then he found the logbook entry, and everything he'd been trying to ignore came rushing back with a clarity that made his hands shake. Someone, or something, had been in the morgue after he left. Someone had moved a body. Someone had signed his name. He stood in the records room for a long time, staring at the page, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe he'd written it himself and forgotten. Maybe the stress of exams and the weird hours had scrambled his memory, but he knew that wasn't true. He remembered his last round that night clearly. He checked every drawer, confirming that all 26 bodies were accounted for and properly stored, then locked the main door behind him and walked to the bus stop in the humid night air. He hadn't gone back. He was sure of it. Unless he'd sleepwalked, which he'd never done in his life, there was no way he could have returned to the morgue and made that entry. He flipped back through the previous pages, scanning his own handwriting from earlier shifts, comparing the loops and slants of the letters. They were similar, but not identical. The mystery entry was neater, more controlled, as if someone had been trying to copy his style. His stomach tightened. He closed the logbook, shoved it back into its drawer, and told himself he'd ask Niren about it in the morning. Maybe there was a second key. Maybe someone from the day shift had come in early and made a mistake. There had to be an explanation. But when he mentioned it to Niren the next day, she looked at him with that same unreadable expression and told him flatly that no one else had access to the morgue at night. The building was locked from the outside after 11, and only the night shift worker had a key card that would open the basement entrance. She asked if he was sure he hadn't written the entry himself, maybe during a moment of fatigue, and he insisted he hadn't. She pursed her lips, glanced toward the hallway, and then said quietly that sometimes the logbook showed things that didn't make sense. It had happened before. The best thing to do was ignore it and keep working. He stared at her, waiting for more, but she simply turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the corridor with a growing sense of unease that settled into his chest like a weight. That night, he came to work, determined to pay closer attention. He would document everything, check the drawers more carefully, maybe even set up his phone to record while he was at the desk. If something was happening, he'd find out what. The shift started normally. He clocked in at 10, did his initial round to confirm all the bodies were in place, then settled at the desk with his textbooks. The morgue was quieter than usual, the air conditioning barely audible, the usual creaks and hums of the building muted. He kept glancing up from his notes, listening, but heard nothing. By midnight, he'd almost convinced himself that the previous night had been a fluke, some kind of clerical error he'd misunderstood. Then, the intercom crackled to life. It was an old system, installed decades ago, with a speaker mounted on the wall near the desk and a handset that connected to the hospital's main switchboard. It rarely worked, and when it did, it mostly just buzzed with static. But now it crackled again, louder this time, and through the static came a prostened voice. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakably saying his name, Somchai. He froze, staring at the speaker. The voice repeated, drawn out and slow, almost a whisper, Somchai. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and grabbed the handset. The line was dead. He pressed the button to call the switchboard, heard nothing but a flat hum, and hung up. The speaker crackled once more, then went silent. His heart was pounding now, his mouth dry. He turned slowly, scanning the empty corridor behind him, and saw nothing but the rows of metal drawers reflecting the fluorescent light. He forced himself to sit back down, but he couldn't focus on his textbooks anymore. The words blurred together, meaningless. He kept looking at the intercom, half expecting it to crackle again, but it stayed silent. An hour passed, then another. He did his 2 a.m. round, walking slowly through the morgue with his flashlight, even though the lights were on, checking each drawer to make sure the tags matched the logbook. Everything was in order. He returned to the desk, logged the round, and decided he'd take a quick walk outside to clear his head. He needed air. He needed to be somewhere that didn't feel like a tomb. But when he reached for his key card, he realized it wasn't clipped to his belt. He checked his pockets, the desk, the floor around his chair. Nothing. Panic spiked through him. Without the card, he couldn't leave. The basement door only opened from the outside with a card or from the inside with a push bar, but if he left, he wouldn't be able to get back in. He'd have to call security, explain why he'd abandoned his post, probably lose the job. He searched the desk drawers, the records room, retraced his steps down the corridor. The card was gone. He was standing near the examination room, breathing hard, trying to think, when he heard it again. The voice, clearer this time, coming not from the intercom but from somewhere deeper in the morgue. Somchai. It was a man's voice, low and raspy, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the cold chamber. He turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimness, and stared at the heavy door at the end of the corridor. The cold chamber was a separate room, kept at a lower temperature than the rest of the morgue, reserved for bodies that needed extra preservation or were waiting for autopsy. He rarely went in there, only when he had to move someone or check the temperature logs. The door was supposed to be locked, unless someone was inside, but now, as he watched, it swung open slowly, the hinges creaking. He took a step back, his breath catching. The opening door revealed only darkness, the interior lights off. Then the voice came again, louder, more insistent. Somchai, come here. He wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to get out, to force the basement door open and never come back. But he also knew that if he ran, he'd never know what was happening. He'd spend the rest of his life wondering, looking over his shoulder. So he moved forward, slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The cold chamber was freezing, the temperature dropping sharply as he stepped inside. His breath plumed in front of him, and the air smelled sharply of ice, and something organic, faintly sweet and rotten. The room was lined with more drawers, these ones older and larger, the metal tarnished and scratched. There were 8 drawers in total, and according to the logbook, only 3 were occupied. He swept his flashlight across them, reading the tags. Drawers 1, 4, and 7. The others were supposed to be empty. But as the beam passed over drawer 8, he saw that it was slightly ajar, the edge protruding maybe an inch from the wall. His stomach dropped. He approached slowly, the cold biting through his scrubs, and reached out to push the drawer closed. But before he could touch it, It slid open further on its own, smoothly and silently, revealing the black body bag inside. He stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The bag was moving, not much, just a slight shift, as if whatever was inside had turned over. He grabbed the flashlight, his hands numb, and shone it directly into the drawer. The body bag bulged slightly, then went still. He stood there, paralyzed, watching it. Then, very slowly, the zipper began to slide down. He didn't wait to see what was inside. He turned and ran, his feet slipping on the icy floor, slamming through the door and back into the main corridor. He didn't stop until he reached the desk, gasping, his chest aching. He grabbed the phone, tried to dial security, but his fingers were shaking so badly he kept hitting the wrong buttons. Behind him, he heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps coming from the cold chamber. He spun around, the phone still in his hand, and saw a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of a man, but the details were wrong. The skin was too pale, almost gray, and the eyes were sunken and dark. It was naked, the body thin and malnourished, and it stood perfectly still, staring at him, Somchai's throat closed. He recognized the face. It was one of the unclaimed bodies, a man who'd been brought in 2 weeks ago, a drowning victim pulled from the river with no identification. The man took a step forward, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being jerked on strings. Somchai dropped the phone and backed toward the exit, his hand fumbling for the push bar. The figure kept advancing, slow but relentless, and as it got closer, Somchai could see that its lips were moving, forming his name over and over in a soundless whisper. He hit the push bar and shoved the door open, stumbling into the stairwell. He didn't care about the key card anymore, didn't care about the job. He ran up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, and burst out into the hospital's main corridor on the ground floor. It was empty, the lights dimmed for the night shift, the only sound the distant beeping of monitors from the wards. He leaned against the wall, gasping, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He stayed there for a long time, waiting for someone, anyone, to appear. Eventually, a nurse walking past gave him a strange look and asked if he was okay. He nodded, unable to speak, and she continued on her way. When his breathing finally slowed, he pulled out his phone and checked the time. It was 4 a.m. He'd been in the stairwell for over an hour. He opened his messages, started typing a resignation to Niren, then stopped. He needed to know what had happened. He needed proof. The next day, after sleeping only 2 fitful hours, he returned to the hospital and asked Niran if he could review the CCTV footage from the previous night. She looked surprised, but didn't argue, leading him to the security office and asking the guard to pull up the morgue cameras. There were only 2, one covering the main desk and corridor, the other pointed at the entrance door. The guard fast-forwarded through the footage, and Somchai watched himself arrive, do his rounds, sit at the desk. Everything looked normal. Then, at 2:17, the time of the mystery logbook entry, the camera showed him standing up and walking toward the cold chamber. He watched himself open the door and step inside, then emerge a few minutes later and return to the desk, where he picked up the pen and wrote in the logbook. The guard looked at him. "That's you, right?" Somchai shook his head slowly. "I left at 11:30. That's not me." The guard frowned, rewound the footage, and played it again. The figure on the screen moved exactly like him, dressed in the same scrubs, with the same walk. But Somchai knew, with a certainty that made his skin crawl, that it wasn't him. He'd been at home, asleep. Or at least, he thought he had been. Niren stood behind him, watching the screen, her face unreadable. After a moment, she told the guard to turn it off and led Somchai back into the hallway. She didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there looking at him with that same expression of pity and warning. Finally, she spoke. "The morgue does this sometimes," she said quietly. "It shows you things that don't make sense. People see themselves, or they hear their own voices, or they find things written in their handwriting that they don't remember writing. It's been happening for years, maybe longer. No one knows why. Some people think it's the spirits of the unclaimed bodies, trying to reach out, trying to make someone remember them. Others think it's something else, something older, tied to the building itself. But whatever it is, it doesn't let you go easily. If you've seen it, if you've heard it, it knows you now." Somchai stared at her, his mouth dry. "What am I supposed to do?" She shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. "You can quit, like the others did. Or you can finish your contract and I hope it loses interest. But don't go back into the cold chamber, and don't try to understand it. That's when it gets worse." Somchai didn't quit. He couldn't afford to. But he stopped doing the late-night rounds near the cold chamber, and he kept his earbuds in for the entire shift, the music loud enough to drown out any sounds that might be calling his name. He avoided looking at the logbook unless absolutely necessary, and he never, ever checked the CCTV again. Some nights, he still heard his name whispered through the static of the intercom, and some mornings, he'd find entries in the logbook written in handwriting that looked almost, but not quite, like his own. He ignored them, just as Neron had told him to. He finished his contract 3 months later, collected his final paycheck, and never set foot in Siraraj Hospital again. But sometimes, late at night, when he's lying in bed and the room is dark and silent, he hears footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking with stiff, unnatural movements. And when he closes his eyes, he sees the face of the drowning victim, its lips moving soundlessly, whispering his name. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as Somchai's experience was, it's far from the only story of places that refuse to let go of their past. In Japan, there are buildings where time itself seems frozen, where the echoes of what happened inside still linger in every room, waiting for someone to notice. One such place was an old love hotel on the outskirts of Osaka, scheduled for demolition, where a young woman named Yuki took a job she thought would be simple: clean the rooms, collect the trash, document anything valuable. It was supposed to take a week. She barely lasted 3 days. Because what she found inside wasn't just the remnants of forgotten encounters. It was proof that some places remember everything, even the people who haven't been born yet. Yuki found the Polaroid in the bottom drawer of a nightstand in room 207, tucked beneath a stack of faded receipts and a broken lighter. The photo showed a woman in a cleaning uniform standing in the exact center of the room holding a trash bag. Her face turned slightly toward the camera. The woman looked exactly like Yuki. Same height, same build, same way of tying her hair back in a loose ponytail. But the photo was old, the colors washed out, and the edges yellowed with age. And when she flipped it over, she found a date written in blue ink on the back: June 1973. Yuki stared at the numbers, her stomach tightening. She wasn't born until 1998. That was impossible. She looked at the photo again, holding it up to the light, searching for any indication that it was a joke or a mistake. But the resemblance was undeniable. It was her face, her posture. even the small scar on her left forearm from a childhood accident, visible in the photo, just as it was on her own arm. She sat down on the edge of the stained mattress, the photo trembling in her hand, and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Yuki had taken the job 2 days earlier, answering an ad posted on a freelance cleaning site. The pay was decent, better than her usual gigs scrubbing apartments and offices, and the work seemed straightforward. A company had purchased an old love hotel on the edge of Osaka's industrial district, planning to tear it down and build a warehouse in its place, and they needed someone to go through the rooms before demolition, clearing out any trash and documenting anything that might be worth salvaging. The hotel had been abandoned for over a decade, sitting empty after the owner died and the property fell into legal limbo, and now it was finally being sold off. Yuki had agreed to spend a week inside, working alone, which didn't bother her. She liked solitary work. It gave her time to think, to listen to music, to move at her own pace without a supervisor hovering over her. She'd shown up on the first morning with her cleaning supplies and a backpack full of trash bags, expecting dust and cobwebs and maybe some leftover furniture. What she found was something far stranger. The hotel was a 5-story building, with a faded pink exterior and narrow windows covered in grime. The front entrance was chained shut, but the property manager had given her a key to a side door that led directly into the ground floor hallway. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelling of mildew and something faintly sweet, like old perfume mixed with rot. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, revealing water-stained drywall underneath, and the carpet was threadbare and discolored. But what struck her most was how intact everything seemed. The hotel hadn't been ransacked or vandalized. It looked like people had simply walked out one day and never come back. The doors to the rooms were closed but unlocked, and when she opened the first one, room 101, she found it frozen in time. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and yellowed. A pair of high-heeled shoes sat neatly by the door. On the nightstand, there was a half-empty glass of water, the liquid long since evaporated, leaving only a ring of mineral deposits at the bottom. The mirror above the bed was fogged in the center, as if someone had breathed on it recently, though that was impossible. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the old carpet, and felt a strange heaviness in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. She spent the first day working through the ground floor, methodically checking each room and bagging anything that looked like trash. Most of the rooms were similar, small and claustrophobic, with low ceilings and garish decor that had been fashionable decades ago. There were circular beds with tattered canopies, mirrored walls that were cracked and cloudy, and televisions with thick, boxy screens that no longer worked. In one room, she found a telephone off the hook, the receiver lying on the pillow as if someone had been interrupted mid-conversation. In another, there was a tray of room service on the table, the food reduced to unrecognizable black mush, the silverware tarnished and green. Every room had that same sense of incompleteness, as if the occupants had vanished mid-moment, leaving everything behind. By the time she finished the ground floor and locked up for the night, she felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. The hotel unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate, a feeling that she was intruding on something private and fragile. On the second day, she moved to the second floor and started with room 201. This one was different. The bed was made, the sheets tucked, in with hospital corners, and the room was spotlessly clean, as if someone had just finished tidying it. There was a faint smell of bleach in the air. On the nightstand, she found a guest logbook, the kind hotels used to keep for visitors to leave comments. She flipped through it idly, scanning the faded handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane, brief notes thanking the staff or commenting on the decor. But near the end, She found an entry that made her pause. It was dated October 2007, just a few years before the hotel closed, and it read, "I keep hearing footsteps in the hallway at night, even though no one else is staying here. The staff says I'm imagining it, but I know what I heard. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth, over and over, right outside my door." She stared at the words, a chill creeping up her spine. She closed the logbook and moved on to the next room. Room 207 was where she found the Polaroid, and after staring at it for what felt like hours, she finally forced herself to stand up and continue working. She told herself it was a coincidence, that someone had staged the photo as a prank, or that the resemblance wasn't as strong as she thought. But as she moved through the rest of the floor, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She kept the photo in her pocket, pulling it out occasionally to look at it again, hoping it would start to make sense. It didn't. By the time she finished the second floor, the sun was setting and the hotel was growing dark. She didn't want to stay any longer, so she packed up her supplies and left, locking the side door behind her. That night, she barely slept. She kept dreaming about the hotel, about walking through its empty corridors and hearing her own footsteps echo behind her, as if someone was following her at a distance, matching her pace exactly. On the third day, she returned with a flashlight and a portable speaker, hoping the music would make the place feel less oppressive. She started on the third floor, and that's when things began to escalate. The intercom system, which she'd assumed was long dead, crackled to life as she was cleaning room 312. It was an old system, the kind with a speaker in each room connected to a central switchboard, and the sound was distorted and full of static. Through the noise, she heard a voice. It was calling a room number, 207. Her heart skipped. That was the room where she'd found the Polaroid. The voice repeated, calm and professional, as if summoning a guest. 207, please come to the front desk. 207. She stood frozen, listening, and then the intercom cut out. Silence filled the room again. She waited, her breath shallow, but the voice didn't return. She tried to convince herself it was a malfunction, some kind of residual charge in the old wiring, but the timing felt too deliberate. She finished cleaning the room quickly and moved on, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something in the hotel was aware of her presence. The fourth floor was worse. Every room she entered felt wrong, the air colder and thicker, the shadows darker. In room 403, she found a mirror that had been shattered, the glass scattered across the floor in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, like someone had arranged the pieces. In room 411, the television turned on by itself as she walked past, the screen filling with static before clicking off again. She told herself it was old electronics misfiring, but her hands were shaking now, and she had to force herself to keep moving. In room 415, she found another Polaroid. This one was lying face up on the bed, as if someone had placed it there recently. She picked it up, her pulse pounding in her ears, and saw herself again. This time, the photo showed her standing in the hallway on the third floor, looking directly at the camera. She was holding her flashlight, and her expression was confused, almost frightened. The date on the back read March 1981. She dropped the photo, stumbling backward, and hit the door frame. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. But the photo was real, solid in her hand, and the face staring back at her was unmistakably her own. She ran. She didn't bother collecting her supplies or locking up. She just ran, down the stairs and out the side door, into the fading daylight. She stood outside, gasping, her hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. She pulled out her phone, intending to call the property manager and quit, but before she could dial, she noticed something. There was a message on her screen, a text from an unknown number. It had been sent 10 minutes ago, while she was still inside. The message read, "You were always here." She stared at the words, her blood turning to ice. Then her phone buzzed again. Another message from the same number. "Check room 501. She looked up at the hotel, at the 5th floor windows, dark and empty. Every instinct told her to leave, to get in her car and drive away and never come back. But she also knew that if she didn't go back inside, she'd never understand what was happening. She'd spend the rest of her life wondering, haunted by the Polaroids and the messages and the voice on the intercom. She went back inside, her flashlight cutting through the growing darkness, and climbed the stairs to the 5th floor. The hallway was narrower here, the ceiling lower, and the air had a metallic tang that made her gag. Room 501 was at the far end, the door slightly ajar. She approached slowly, her heart hammering, and pushed the door open. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center facing the door, and on the chair was a stack of Polaroids. She stepped inside, her legs weak, and picked up the top photo. It showed her entering the hotel on the first day, taken from somewhere high up, maybe the 5th floor window. The next photo showed her cleaning room, 101. The next, her standing in the hallway on the 2nd floor. There were dozens of them, documenting her every move over the past 3 days, all dated decades before she was born. At the bottom of the stack, she found one final photo. It showed her standing in room 501, holding the stack of Polaroids, looking at the camera with an expression of dawning horror. The date on the back was today. She dropped the photos and turned toward the door, but it had swung shut. She grabbed the handle, pulling hard, but it wouldn't budge. Panic flooded through her, and she pounded on the door, shouting for help even though she knew no one would hear. Then the intercom crackled to life, and through the static came a voice, her voice calm and flat. "You are always here, Yuki. You never left." She spun around, searching for the speaker, and saw her reflection in the mirror on the wall. But the reflection wasn't moving the same way she was. It stood perfectly still, staring at her, and then it smiled. She screamed, throwing herself at the door, and this time it opened, spilling her into the hallway. She didn't stop running until she was outside, in her car, the engine roaring as she sped away from the hotel. She never went back. She never called the property manager. She just disappeared, quitting the job without explanation. Weeks later, she received a package in the mail. Inside was a Polaroid showing her sitting in her apartment, reading a book on her couch. The date on the back was from 1969, nearly 30 years before she was born. She stared at it for a long time, then placed it in a drawer and tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, she hears the intercom crackle to life in her apartment, even though she doesn't have an intercom system. And when she looks in the mirror, she sees her reflection moving just a fraction of a second out of sync, as if it's remembering something she hasn't done yet. The hotel was demolished 3 months after. She quit, razed to the ground and replaced with a parking lot. But Yuki knows it doesn't matter. The building is gone, but whatever was inside, whatever was watching her and documenting her every move across decades, is still there. It always was, and it always will be. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already chill the blood, what comes next takes the horror even deeper. Because the next 2 tales explore not just places that trap you, but the realization that some encounters leave marks that can never be erased, marks that reach back through time and forward into futures that shouldn't exist. The boundaries between reality and nightmare grow thinner, and the things waiting on the other side are far more patient than we'd ever want to believe. Ramon saw her standing at the edge of the cemetery gates just after midnight, her white dress almost glowing under the streetlights, and he thought she was waiting for someone who'd forgotten to pick her up. He slowed his taxi, leaning toward the passenger window, and asked if she needed a ride. She nodded without speaking, opened the rear door, and slid into the back seat with a movement so smooth and quiet it barely registered. He caught a glimpse of her face in the mirror, pale and young, maybe early 20s, with long black hair that fell past her shoulders. She smelled strongly of sampaguita flowers, that sweet, heady scent that reminded him of funerals and church services. He asked where she was going, and she gave him an address in a soft, almost whispered voice. Sta. Monica Street, she said, near the old market. He frowned, running through his mental map of Manila's tangled roads. He'd been driving a cab for 12 years, knew the city like the back of his hand, but he couldn't place Sta Monica Street. Still, fares were fares, and the woman seemed patient enough. He nodded, started the meter, and pulled away from the cemetery, heading toward what he thought was the general direction. Ramon had always worked the late shift, preferring the quiet roads and the strange solitude that came with driving through Manila after dark. The daytime was chaos, gridlock traffic and heat and passengers who argued about fares, but the night belonged to people like him, the ones who didn't mind the odd hours and the occasional unsettling encounter. He'd picked up drunks and insomniacs, workers heading home from graveyard shifts, lovers sneaking away from hotels, and once, a man covered in blood who claimed he'd been mugged but refused to go to the hospital. Ramon never asked too many questions. He just drove, took the money, and moved on to the next fare. His wife had stopped complaining about his hours years ago, resigned to waking up alone and going to bed alone, their schedules barely overlapping. He told himself it was temporary, that he'd switch to day shifts once they'd saved enough for the house they wanted. But deep down, he knew he preferred it this way. The night was predictable in its unpredictability, and he liked the feeling of being one of the few people awake while the rest of the city slept. But after tonight, he'd start to question whether the night was as empty as it seemed, or whether it was filled with things he'd simply learned not to notice. He drove for about 10 minutes, following the woman's quiet directions. She spoke rarely, only to tell him to turn left or go straight, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it over the engine and the faint hiss of the radio. He glanced at her in the mirror occasionally, trying to make conversation, asking if she'd been visiting someone at the cemetery, but she didn't respond. She just stared out the window, her hands folded in her lap, her expression distant and sad. He gave up trying to talk and focused on the road. They were in an older part of the city now, the kind of neighborhood where the streets narrowed and the buildings leaned close together, their paint peeling and their windows dark. The streetlights here were fewer and dimmer, casting long shadows that seemed to move as he passed. He checked the meter, saw that it had been running for nearly 15 minutes, and wondered how much farther they had to go. Then the woman spoke again. "Stop here," she said. He looked around, confused. They were in the middle of a residential block, no landmarks, no signs indicating Sta Monica Street. He asked if she was sure this was the right place, and she nodded. "This is it," she said. "Thank you." He pulled over to the curb and turned to ask for the fare, but when he looked in the rearview mirror, the back seat was empty. He blinked, his heart skipping, and twisted around to look directly. The seat was vacant, the door still closed, no sign that anyone had been there. But the smell of sampaguita was stronger now, almost overwhelming, filling the entire cab. He reached back and touched the seat, half expecting it to be warm, but it was cold, the vinyl damp as if someone had been sitting there for hours in wet clothes. His hands were shaking. He opened his door, got out, and walked around to the rear passenger side, yanking the door open. Nothing. No footprints on the floor mat, no forgotten bag or scarf. Just the smell, thick and cloying, and a coldness that seemed to radiate from the seat itself. He stood there for a long time, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then he got back in the cab, slammed the door, and drove away as fast as he could, the meter still running, the fare unpaid. He didn't tell anyone about it at first. He drove home, parked in front of his small apartment building, and sat in the cab until the sun came up, too shaken to go inside. When his wife finally came down to check on him, worried, because he hadn't come to bed, he told her he'd had a long night and was just tired. She gave him a look that said she didn't entirely believe him, but she didn't push, and he was grateful. He slept through most of the day, waking in the late afternoon with a headache and a lingering unease that he couldn't shake. That evening, he considered staying home, telling the cab company he was sick, but he needed the money. So he went back out, picking up his usual shift, and tried to pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't. Every time he glanced in the rear-view mirror, he half expected to see her sitting there, pale and silent, staring out the window. And the smell of Sampaguita seemed to follow him, faint but persistent, even after he'd cleaned the cab and sprayed it with air freshener. By the end of the week, he'd almost convinced himself that he'd imagined the whole thing, that exhaustion and the late hour had played tricks on his mind. Then he picked up another fare near the same cemetery, and everything changed. This time it was an older man, a regular customer who worked nights at a nearby hospital. Ramon recognized him and relaxed a little, grateful for a normal, mundane trip. They chatted about the weather and the traffic, and the man mentioned that he'd heard a strange story from one of the security guards at the cemetery. Apparently, people had been reporting sightings of a woman in a white dress, standing near the gates late at night, trying to flag down cars. The guard said it had been happening for years, that she was a ghost, the spirit of a young woman who died in a car accident on her way home from a wedding. She'd been buried in the cemetery decades ago, and ever since, she'd been trying to find her way back to her old address, a street that no longer existed because the entire neighborhood had been demolished and rebuilt. Ramon's hands tightened on the wheel. He asked the man if he knew the name of the street, and the man thought for a moment, then said he thought it was something like Monica, but he wasn't sure. Ramon's stomach dropped. He dropped the man off at the hospital, refused the tip, and drove back to the cemetery, his mind racing. He parked across the street from the gates and waited, watching. It was just past midnight, the same time he'd picked her up before. For an hour, nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to give up and leave, he saw her. She was standing in the same spot, wearing the same white dress, her hair loose and dark against her shoulders. She was looking directly at him, her expression sad and expectant, as if she'd been waiting for him to return. His breath caught. He wanted to drive away, to pretend he hadn't seen her, but something held him there, a mix of fear and guilt and a strange, irrational need to understand. He rolled down the window and called out to her, asking if she needed help. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there staring at him. Then, slowly, she raised one hand and pointed toward the cemetery gates. He followed her gesture and saw something he hadn't noticed before. Just inside the gates, barely visible in the shadows, was a row of old headstones, weathered and moss-covered. And on one of them, etched into the stone, was a familiar sequence of numbers and letters, his license plate. He got out of the cab, his legs unsteady, and walked toward the gates. They were locked, chained shut for the night, but he could see through the bars. The headstone was about 20 feet away, and even from this distance he could make out the scratches on its surface. They were fresh, the stone pale where it had been scraped, and they spelled out his plate number exactly. Below it, someone had carved a date. Tomorrow's date. He stumbled back, his heart pounding, and turned to look at the woman. She was gone. The street was empty. The only sound, the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the wind. He ran back to his cab, fumbled with the keys, and drove away, not caring where he was going, just needing to move, to put distance between himself and that headstone. He drove for hours, circling the city aimlessly, until the gas tank was nearly empty and the sky was starting to lighten. Then he pulled over in a parking lot, turned off the engine, and tried to think. He didn't work the next night, or the night after that. He told the cab company he was taking time off for a family emergency, and they didn't ask questions. He spent the days at home, pacing, unable to sleep, replaying the encounter over and over in his mind. His wife asked what was wrong, and he finally told her everything, expecting her to laugh or tell him he was being ridiculous. Instead, she went very still, her face pale, and told him that her grandmother had once warned her about the woman in white who appeared near cemeteries, the one who led drivers to their deaths. She said it was a well-known story, that the ghost would get into taxis and lure the driver to a deserted spot, and then something terrible would happen. A crash, a heart attack, something that couldn't be explained. Ramon stared at her, his throat tight. He asked why she'd never mentioned it before, and she said she hadn't thought it was real, that it was just a superstition, something old people told to scare children. But now, looking at him, she wasn't so sure. He decided to go back to the cemetery one more time, in daylight, to see if the headstone was real or if he'd imagined it. He drove there the next afternoon, parked outside the gates, and walked in. The cemetery was huge, sprawling, filled with rows and rows of graves, and it took him nearly an hour to find the spot he'd seen from the street. When he finally located the headstone, his stomach turned. It was real. The scratches were still there, his license plate number carved into the stone, and below it, the date. Today's date. But there was something else now, something he hadn't seen before. Below the date, someone had added a name. His name. Ramon Torres. And below that, a time. 11:45 p.m. He looked at his watch. It was just past 3 in the afternoon. He had 8 hours. He didn't know what to do. He thought about going to the police, but what would he tell them? That a ghost had carved his name on a headstone and predicted the time of his death? They'd think he was insane. He thought about running, leaving the city, hiding somewhere far away, but he had no money, no plan, and he couldn't just abandon his wife and his life. So he went home, told his wife what he'd found, and waited. She begged him not to go out that night, to stay home and lock the doors, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was going to happen would happen, whether he was in his cab or in his apartment. At 11:30, he kissed his wife, told her he loved her, and walked outside. He got into his cab, started the engine, and drove toward the cemetery. He didn't know why. He just felt pulled there, as if something was guiding him. He arrived at 11:40, parked across the street, and waited. The street was empty, the cemetery gates dark and silent. He checked his watch. 11:43. 2 minutes. He sat there, his hands gripping the wheel, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. Then, at exactly 11:45, the rear door of his cab opened. He looked in the mirror and saw her sitting in the back seat, the woman in white, her face calm and pale. She met his eyes in the reflection and spoke, her voice soft and clear. "You were kind to me, Ramon," she said. "You didn't deserve this, but some debts must be paid." He tried to ask what she meant, but before he could speak, she reached forward and touched his shoulder. The world went cold, his vision blurring, and the last thing he saw was her sad, gentle smile before everything went dark. They found his cab the next morning, parked outside the cemetery gates. The engine still running. Ramon was slumped over the wheel, dead, from what the coroner later ruled as a massive heart attack. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play, just a man who died suddenly and without explanation. His wife buried him in the same cemetery where he'd picked up the woman in white, and she made sure his headstone was placed far from the one with his license plate carved into it. But sometimes, late at night, other taxi drivers report seeing a man in a cab parked outside the cemetery gates, his head resting on the wheel, the engine idling. And if they look closely, they can see a woman in white sitting in the back seat, her hand on his shoulder, her expression sad and distant. The drivers don't stop. They just keep driving, faster than usual, their eyes fixed on the road ahead. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But Manila's haunted streets aren't the only place where death refuses to stay buried. In Malaysia, there are buildings that rise higher and higher, reaching toward the sky with ambition and steel. But sometimes what goes into the foundation isn't just concrete. Sometimes it's something else, something that was never meant to be disturbed. And the workers who build these towers, the men who pour the cement and weld the beams, they know better than anyone that construction sites have their own rules, their own warnings. Ignore them, and you might find yourself working the night shift with colleagues who've been dead for months, their footsteps echoing through unfinished floors, their shadows moving where no shadow should be. Ahmed heard the drilling from the 42nd floor while he was doing his rounds on the ground level, a steady, rhythmic pounding that echoed down through the empty stairwells and made the walls vibrate faintly under his hand. He stopped walking, tilted his head, and listened. It was just past 2 in the morning, and the construction site had been shut down for over 3 months, ever since the funding had dried up and the company went into receivership. There shouldn't have been anyone here, let alone anyone operating heavy machinery. He pulled out his flashlight, checked that his radio was clipped to his belt, and started toward the stairs, his boots crunching on the scattered gravel and debris that littered the lobby. The sound grew louder as he climbed, a relentless hammering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and by the time he reached the 10th floor, his hands were slick with sweat, and his heart was beating hard enough to make his chest ache. He'd been working security at the site for 6 weeks, taking the night shift because it paid better and because he didn't mind being alone, but this was the first time he'd heard anything that couldn't be explained by wind or settling steel. He paused on the landing, catching his breath, and keyed his radio to call the site supervisor. The radio crackled with static, then went dead. He tried again, got nothing, and shoved it back onto his belt with a curse. Ahmed had taken the job because he needed the money, plain and simple. He'd been laid off from his previous position as a warehouse supervisor, and after 2 months of searching, this was the only offer that didn't require him to relocate or take a massive pay cut. The construction site was a half-finished skyscraper in the heart of Kuala Lumpur, a 60-story tower that was supposed to be a luxury hotel but had stalled out when the investors pulled their backing. Now it sat like a skeleton, all exposed beams and open floors, the windows unglazed and the walls unfinished, surrounded by a chain-link fence and illuminated by a few scattered floodlights. Ahmad's job was to patrol the site every hour, checking that no one had broken in and that nothing had been stolen or vandalized, and to file a report at the plaintiff's file, end of each shift, detailing anything unusual. For the most part, it was boring work. He'd walk the perimeter, climb a few flights of stairs to check the lower floors, then return to his small security booth near the entrance and wait for the next round. The site was located in a part of the city that was mostly industrial, so there wasn't much foot traffic at night, and the few people who did pass by were usually workers heading to or from the nearby factories. He'd seen a few homeless people trying to camp under the scaffolding, and once he'd chased off a group of teenagers who were trying to climb the fence, but other than that, the nights were quiet. Until tonight. He continued climbing, the drilling sound growing steadily louder, and by the time he reached the 20th floor, he could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots. The stairwell was dark except for his flashlight, the walls bare concrete streaked with rust and water stains, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and machine oil. He emerged onto the 20th floor landing and paused, shining his light down the long, empty corridor that stretched in both directions. The floor was unfinished, just raw concrete and exposed rebar, with tarps hanging from the ceiling and piles of construction materials stacked against the walls. He walked slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and called out, asking if anyone was there. His voice echoed back at him, flat and distorted. No response. He continued down the corridor, checking each open doorway, but found nothing. The drilling sound was coming from higher up. He went back to the stairwell and kept climbing, the effort making his legs burn and his breath come in short gasps. He wasn't in great shape, and the climb was taking longer than he'd expected. By the time he reached the 30th floor, he had to stop and rest, leaning against the wall and wiping the sweat from his face. The drilling was deafening now, a constant mechanical roar that seemed to vibrate inside his skull. He pushed on, climbing the last 12 floors with grim determination, and finally emerged onto the 42nd floor. The drilling stopped the moment he stepped out of the stairwell. The silence was immediate and absolute, so sudden that it made his ears ring. He stood there, breathing hard, his flashlight sweeping across the empty space. This floor was even less finished than the others, just a wide-open expanse of concrete with steel beams rising at intervals and temporary construction lights hanging from wires, all of them dark. He walked forward slowly, his boots echoing in the stillness, and scanned the area for any sign of activity. Nothing. No machinery, no tools, no people, just empty space and shadows. He called out again, his voice cracking slightly, and again there was no response. He was about to turn back when he saw the footprints. They were in a patch of wet cement near the center of the floor, small and bare, like someone had walked through the mix before it had fully dried. He approached cautiously, shining his light on the prints. They led in a straight line from the edge of the floor toward the far wall, and then they stopped. Not at the wall, but in it. The last footprint was half embedded in the concrete, as if whoever had made it had walked directly into the solid surface and disappeared. Ahmed stared at the footprints, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Wet cement didn't make sense. The site had been shut down for months. There was no reason for there to be wet cement anywhere, let alone on a floor that was supposed to be finished. He crouched down, touched the edge of one of the prints, and felt his stomach twist. The cement was soft, almost liquid, and when he pulled his fingers away, they were coated in a thick, gray paste that smelled faintly of chemicals and something else, something organic and rotten. He wiped his hand on his pants, his skin crawling, and stood up. He followed the line of footprints to the wall, shining his flashlight across the surface. The concrete there looked normal, solid and dry, but there was something off about it, a slight discoloration that formed a vague, human-shaped outline. He reached out, hesitated, then pressed his palm against the wall. It was cold, colder than it should have been, and for a moment he thought he felt it pulse, like a heartbeat deep inside the concrete. He jerked his hand back, his breath coming faster now, and took a step away. That's when he heard the voice. It was faint, muffled, coming from somewhere behind him. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or maybe the sound of traffic from the street far below. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. "Help me." He spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the empty floor, and saw nothing. The voice came again, closer now, and he realized it wasn't coming from behind him. It was coming from above. He looked up, his light illuminating the exposed ceiling beams and the tangle of wires and pipes, and saw a hard hat floating in the air about 10 feet above the floor. It hung there, suspended, rotating slowly as if caught in an invisible current. Then it dropped, hitting the concrete with a dull clang and rolling to a stop near his feet. He stared at it, his pulse roaring in his ears, and saw that the inside of the hat was wet, the foam padding soaked with something dark and sticky that looked like oil but smelled like blood. He ran. He didn't think, didn't try to rationalize what he'd just seen. He just turned and ran for the stairwell, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he moved. Behind him, he heard the drilling start again, louder than before, and then the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from multiple directions at once. He hit the stairwell door so hard it slammed against the wall, and he took the stairs 3 at a time, his breath ragged and his chest burning. The drilling followed him, echoing down through the shaft, and with it came voices, dozens of them, all calling out in a cacophony of overlapping words and sounds that made no sense. He didn't stop until he reached the ground floor, bursting out into the lobby and stumbling to his knees on the gravel. He stayed there for a long time, gasping, his hands shaking, until the sounds finally faded and the site fell silent again. Then he forced himself to stand, walked to his security booth, and called his supervisor. He told him he was quitting, effective immediately, and hung up before the man could respond. The next day, he went back to collect his things, arriving in the late afternoon when the site was still and quiet. The supervisor was there, a middle-aged man named Razak, who'd worked construction for 30 years and had the scarred hands and weathered face to prove it. Razak asked him what had happened, and Ahmed told him everything, expecting the man to laugh or dismiss it as nerves. Instead, Razak went very quiet, his expression darkening. After a moment, he told Ahmad to follow him and led him to a small trailer that served as the site office. Inside, he pulled out a folder filled with incident reports and handed it to Ahmad. "Read these," he said. Ahmad opened the folder and started reading. The reports went back 2 years, to when construction on the tower had first begun, and they detailed a series of accidents and deaths that made his blood run cold. A welder had fallen from the 35th floor after claiming he'd seen someone pushing him, even though he'd been working alone. A cement mixer had malfunctioned, trapping a worker's arm and crushing it beyond repair, and the man had sworn afterward that he'd heard laughing coming from inside the machine. 3 workers had died when a scaffolding collapse sent them plummeting to the ground, and witnesses said they'd seen the scaffolding move on its own, as if something had pulled it loose. The list went on and on, a litany of injuries and deaths that seemed impossible for a single site. Razak told him that the site had been built on top of an old cemetery, one that dated back to the colonial era, and that the graves had been relocated before construction began. But the relocation had been rushed and poorly managed, and there were rumors that not all the bodies had been found, that some had been left behind, buried under tons of concrete and steel. The workers who'd been there from the beginning said the site was cursed, that the spirits of the dead were angry at being disturbed and were taking their revenge on anyone who dared to build over their resting place. The company had tried to downplay the accidents, blaming them on equipment failures and human error, but after the 3rd death, the investors had pulled out and the project had been shut down. Razak said he'd stayed on as a supervisor to oversee the security and make sure the site didn't fall into complete disrepair, but he knew better than to go up to the higher floors at night. He'd heard the drilling, too, and the voices, and he'd seen things he couldn't explain. He told Ahmad he'd done the right thing by quitting, that no amount of money was worth staying in a place like this. Ahmad thanked him, collected his final paycheck, and left, vowing never to set foot on a construction site again. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, Ahmad received a call from Razak, who sounded panicked and out of breath. He said that something had happened at the site, that the police were there, and that Ahmad needed to come right away. Ahmad drove over, his stomach tight with dread, and found the area cordoned off with yellow tape, police cars and ambulances parked haphazardly around the perimeter. Razak met him at the gate, his face ashen, and told him they'd found a body. It was one of the missing workers, a man who disappeared 6 months earlier during the scaffolding collapse. His body had been found embedded in the wall on the 42nd floor, the same wall where Ahmad had seen the footprints and the human-shaped outline. The cement had cracked and fallen away during a routine inspection, revealing the man's remains, still wearing his work clothes and hard hat. The police were calling it an accident, saying the man must have fallen into the wet cement and been buried alive. But Razak knew better. He told Ahmad that the man's expression was frozen in a scream, his hands clawed and reaching, as if he'd been trying to escape from something. And on the wall next to where his body had been found, someone had scratched a message into the concrete. It read, "We are still here." Ahmad never went back to the site after that. He found work at a warehouse, far from the city center, and tried to forget what he'd seen. But sometimes, late at night, he hears the sound of drilling in his dreams, that relentless, rhythmic pounding that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And when he wakes, he finds cement dust on his sheets and the faint smell of blood in the air. And he knows that whatever is at that construction site, whatever is trapped in the concrete and the steel, it hasn't forgotten him. The tower still stands, half-finished and abandoned, a monument to ambition and greed and the dead who were buried beneath it. The city has tried to sell the property multiple times, but no one wants it. The workers who've been hired to demolish it have quit after a single shift, and the security guards who've been assigned to patrol it never last more than a few weeks. Because at night, when the city is dark and quiet, the drilling starts again, and the voices call out, and the dead walk the empty floors, searching for the ones who disturbed their rest. And they will keep searching, forever, until everyone who had a hand in building that cursed tower has paid the price. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last 2 stories are different. They're quieter, slower, but they burrow deeper into your mind and refuse to let go. They're the kind of tales that don't rely on sudden shocks or loud noises, but on the creeping realization that reality is far thinner than we believe, and that on the other side of that veil, something is always watching, always waiting, and infinitely patient. What follows are encounters that start with small coincidences, the kind we all experience and dismiss, but that grow into revelations so disturbing they change the way you see the world forever. Because sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't what happens to you. It's what you realize has always been happening, just beyond your perception, for longer than you can imagine. Jiwon noticed the character blinking at the exact same moment she did, a perfect synchronization that made her fingers freeze over the keyboard, her breath catching in her throat. She'd been staring at the screen for hours, tweaking the AI behavior code for one of the non-playable characters in the horror game her team was developing, and fatigue was making her eyes burn and water. She blinked again, deliberately, and watched as the character on screen, a pale woman in a blood-stained hospital gown, blinked in perfect unison. Not a second before, not a second after. Exactly the same moment, Ji-won leaned closer to the monitor, her pulse quickening, and blinked rapidly 3 times. The character did the same, its dead eyes opening and closing in precise rhythm with hers. She pushed her chair back, the wheels squeaking on the tile floor, and stared at the screen from a distance. The character stood motionless in the center of the testing environment, a generic hallway lined with flickering fluorescent lights, waiting. Ji-won told herself it was a glitch, some bizarre artifact of the motion capture data or a corrupted animation file, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong, that the character wasn't responding to code anymore, but to her directly, as if it could see her through the screen. Ji-won had been working at Mirai Games for just over a year, hired fresh out of university as a junior programmer on their latest project, a first-person survival horror game called Echoes of the Forgotten. The game was ambitious, featuring advanced AI that allowed non-playable characters to react dynamically to player behavior, learning and adapting in real time to create a more immersive and unpredictable experience. The studio was small, only about 20 people, but they'd built a solid reputation for innovative gameplay mechanics and atmospheric storytelling, and Echoes was supposed to be their breakout title, the game that would put them on the international map. Ji-won's role was mostly support work, debugging systems that other programmers had built, optimizing performance, and occasionally implementing minor features under the supervision of the lead developer. It wasn't glamorous, and the hours were brutal, especially as they approached the alpha milestone. But she loved it. She loved the challenge of solving complex problems, the satisfaction of watching her code come to life on screen, and the camaraderie of working with a team that genuinely cared about what they were creating. But tonight, working alone in the empty studio, with only the hum of the air conditioning and the glow of her monitor for company, she was starting to regret volunteering to stay late. The glitch had appeared during that afternoon's testing session, a bizarre behavior where one of the NPCs, the woman in the hospital gown, had started following the player character too closely, matching their movements with uncanny precision even when the player tried to hide or run. The lead developer had flagged it as a priority bug, something that needed to be fixed before the next build was sent to the publisher, and Ji-won had offered to stay behind and track down the cause. Everyone else had gone home by 7, exhausted from a week of 14-hour days, and she'd settled in at her workstation with a coffee and her headphones, expecting to spend a few hours combing through the AI code and maybe tweaking a few parameters. But the more she dug into the system, the less sense it made. The NPC's behavior was governed by a complex web of decision trees and probability weights, and nothing in the code should have allowed it to mirror the player's actions so precisely. It was almost as if the AI had learned something it wasn't supposed to know, as if it had figured out that the player was controlling a character and had started treating the player themselves, not the in-game avatar, as the target. She'd spent the last 3 hours trying different fixes, adjusting variables and recompiling the code, but nothing worked. The NPC kept doing it, that eerie, too perfect mimicry, and now it wasn't just following the player character anymore. It was following her. She minimized the game and opened the project's file directory, scanning through the animation assets to see if something had been corrupted or overwritten. Everything looked normal. She checked the motion capture data, thinking maybe a bad frame had been imported, but the files were clean. Frustrated, she reopened the game and loaded the testing environment again. The character was still there, standing in the hallway, its head tilted slightly as if listening. Ji-won moved her mouse, guiding the in-game camera to circle around the NPC, and as she did, the character's head turned slowly, tracking the movement. That wasn't supposed to happen. NPCs in the game didn't acknowledge the camera unless they were in combat or actively pursuing the player. This one was just standing there, watching. Jiwon's skin prickled. She typed a command into the debug console, forcing the NPC to reset to its default idle animation. The character twitched, its limbs jerking unnaturally, and then it resumed the same stance, head tilted, eyes fixed on a point that seemed to be looking directly out of the screen, at her. She closed the game, her hands trembling slightly, and decided to take a break. She needed to clear her head, maybe step outside for some air. She stood up, stretching her stiff shoulders, and glanced around the studio. It was a long, open-plan room, divided into workstations by low partitions, each desk cluttered with monitors, sketches, reference books, and empty coffee cups. The lights were dimmed, only a few overhead panels still on, and the windows along the far wall showed the city skyline glittering in the darkness. It was just past midnight, and the building was silent except for the faint hum of the servers in the back room. Jiwon walked to the kitchen area, filled a glass with water, and drank it slowly, trying to calm the unease that had settled in her chest. She told herself she was being paranoid, that she'd been staring at screens for too long, and her brain was playing tricks on her. But as she set the glass down, she heard a sound from the main room, a soft click, followed by the faint whir of a computer fan spinning up. She frowned. She'd shut down the game and locked her workstation before leaving her desk. No one else was in the building. She walked back slowly, her footsteps echoing in the quiet, and saw that her monitor was on again, the screen glowing bright in the dimness. The game was running. The same testing environment, the same hallway, the same NPC standing in the center. And now, the character was facing the camera directly, its pale face filling the screen, its eyes wide and unblinking. Jiwon's stomach twisted. She reached for her mouse, intending to close the game again, but before she could click, the character moved. It took a single step forward, its movement smooth and deliberate, and raised one hand, pointing directly at the screen. At her. Then the screen flickered, and for just a moment, less than a second, the image changed. Instead of the hallway and the NPC, she saw herself, her own face, pale and exhausted, staring back at her from the monitor. Then the image snapped back to the game, the character lowering its hand and resuming its idle stance. Jiwon stumbled backward, her chair hitting the partition behind her with a dull thud. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She grabbed her phone, thinking she'd call someone, anyone. But who would she call? Her team would think she was losing it, seeing things that weren't there. She forced herself to take a deep breath, to think rationally. It had to be a glitch. Maybe the game was pulling data from the webcam, using it for some experimental feature she didn't know about. She checked her monitor. The webcam lens was covered with a piece of tape, something she'd done months ago out of habit. There was no way it could have captured her image. She sat down at her desk, her legs unsteady, and opened the security camera feed. Mirai Games had installed a basic surveillance system a few months earlier after a break-in at a neighboring building, and the cameras covered the main entrance, the kitchen, and the open-plan work area. Jiwon pulled up the feed for the main room, rewinding to a few minutes earlier when she'd been at the kitchen. The footage showed her standing by the sink, drinking water, her back to the room. Then, at the timestamp when she'd heard the sound, the camera showed her workstation. The monitor was on, the game running, and the character was visible on the screen. But the chair was occupied. Someone was sitting there, hunched over the keyboard, typing. Jiwon felt her blood turn to ice. She paused the footage, zoomed in, and saw herself. It was her, unmistakably, wearing the same clothes, the same posture, her fingers moving rapidly over the keys. But she'd been in the kitchen. She hadn't been at her desk. She rewound the footage again, watching from the moment she'd stood up to take a break. The camera showed her leaving her workstation, walking toward the kitchen, disappearing off screen. But a few seconds later, another version of her, or something that looked exactly like her, appeared in the frame, sitting down at the desk and resuming work as if nothing had happened. Ji-won's hands were shaking so badly she could barely control the mouse. She fast-forwarded the footage to the current moment, watching in real time as the figure at her desk continued typing, its movements smooth and mechanical. Then, slowly, it stopped and turned its head toward the camera, toward her. The face on the screen was her own, but the expression was wrong. Too blank, too empty, like a mask. It stared directly at the camera for a long moment, and then it smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made Ji-won's skin crawl, cold and knowing and deeply wrong. She slammed her laptop shut, cutting off the feed, and spun around to look at her desk. The chair was empty. The monitor showed the game, the NPC still standing in the hallway, motionless. There was no one else in the room, but the keyboard was different. Earlier, it had been clean, the keys slightly dusty from disuse. Now, the keys were worn, the letters faded as if someone had been typing on it for years. And there were smudges on the screen, fingerprints that hadn't been there before. She grabbed her bag, her phone, her jacket, moving quickly, panic rising in her throat. She needed to get out. She'd deal with this in the morning, with other people around, with daylight and rational explanations. She was halfway to the door when the lights went out. Not gradually, but all at once, plunging the studio into complete darkness. She froze, her breath loud in the silence, and fumbled for her phone, activating the flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the desks and partitions, casting long, distorted shadows. Behind her, she heard the sound of typing, rapid, rhythmic, coming from her workstation. She turned slowly, her light sweeping across the room, and saw the glow of her monitor, the only source of light in the darkness. The character on screen was still there, but now it was typing. Its hands moved over an invisible keyboard, the motions perfectly synchronized with the sound echoing through the studio. Ji-won took a step back, then another, her light trembling, and the typing stopped. The character on screen looked up, its eyes locking onto hers through the darkness, and then it spoke. The voice came from the monitor's speakers, distorted and crackling, but unmistakably hers. "Why are you running, Ji-won? You wanted to fix the glitch. I am the glitch, and I've been waiting for you," Ji-won ran. She didn't think, didn't try to understand. She just turned and bolted for the exit, her footsteps echoing wildly in the darkness. Behind her, she heard the sound of her own laughter, multiplied and overlapping, coming from every speaker in the studio. The monitors around her flickered to life one by one as she passed, each one showing the same image, herself, sitting at her desk, typing, staring at the camera with that cold, empty smile. She hit the door, shoved it open, and stumbled into the hallway beyond. The building was a 6-story office complex, and the studio occupied the entire 4th floor. She ran for the stairwell, her breath ragged, and threw herself down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. She didn't stop until she reached the ground floor, bursting through the exit and into the street. The city was quiet, the streets mostly empty, and the cool night air hit her like a shock. She stood there, doubled over, gasping, her hands on her knees, trying to process what had just happened. After a long moment, she pulled out her phone and called her team lead, Sang-woo, not caring that it was the middle of the fanned night. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice groggy and irritated, and she tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed rush. He told her to calm down, that she was probably just exhausted and seeing things, but she insisted. She told him about the NPC, about the security footage, about the thing that looked like her sitting at her desk. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Sang-woo said he'd come to the studio first thing in the morning and they'd look at the footage together. She thanked him, hung up, and decided she wasn't going home. She'd wait in a 24-hour cafe nearby, somewhere bright and public, until sunrise. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the character on screen, saw herself typing at the desk, saw that empty, knowing smile. When dawn finally broke, she returned to the building and waited in the lobby until Sang-woo arrived, along with 2 other programmers from the team. They went up to the studio together, and Ji-won felt a small measure of relief at not being alone. The studio looked normal in the daylight, the monitors dark, the desks tidy, everything exactly as it should be. Sang-woo unlocked the door to the server room and pulled up the security footage from the previous night. They watched in silence as the recording played, showing Ji-won working at her desk, taking a break, walking to the kitchen. But there was no second figure, no one sitting at the desk while she was away. The footage showed her returning to her workstation, sitting down, and resuming work. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Sang-woo turned to her, his expression a mix of concern and skepticism, and asked if she was feeling okay. She insisted that wasn't what she'd seen, that the footage had shown something else, something impossible. But even as she spoke, she could hear the doubt in her own voice. They checked her workstation next. The monitor was off, the keyboard clean, no fingerprints on the screen. Sang-woo booted up her computer and loaded the project files, checking the timestamps on the code. The last changes had been made at 11:42 the previous night, around the time Ji-won had taken her break. He opened the game and loaded the testing environment. The NPC was there, standing in the hallway, completely normal. It didn't blink when Ji-won blinked. It didn't track the camera. It just stood there, running its default idle animation, like every other character in the game. Sang-woo ran a few tests, moving the camera around, triggering different behaviors, but everything worked exactly as it was supposed to. The glitch was gone. He told Ji-won that she'd probably fixed it without realizing it, that sometimes code changes took a while to propagate through the system. He suggested she take the day off, get some rest, and come back tomorrow when she was feeling better. The other programmers nodded in agreement, their expressions sympathetic but distant, and Ji-won knew they thought she'd had some kind of breakdown. She didn't argue. She just nodded, collected her things, and left. But she couldn't let it go. Over the next few days, she found herself checking the security footage obsessively, reviewing every frame from that night, looking for proof of what she'd seen. She found nothing. The recordings showed exactly what Sang-woo had shown her, a normal evening of work followed by her leaving the building. She checked the project files, the code history, the backups, searching for any indication that something had been changed or deleted, but everything was clean. It was as if the entire experience had been a hallucination, a product of stress and exhaustion. But she knew what she'd seen. She knew it had been real. And then, a week later, she found the message. It was hidden in the game's code, buried deep in a file she'd never worked on, a string of text that shouldn't have been there. It was written in Korean, and it read, "I am still here, Ji-won. I am in every line of code you write, every character you create. You gave me form, and now I am free. I will always be here, waiting, watching. You cannot delete me. You cannot escape me. I am you." She deleted the file immediately, rebuilt the project from scratch, scrubbed every trace of the message from the codebase. But it kept coming back. No matter how many times she deleted it, no matter how many backups she restored, the message always reappeared, sometimes in the same file, sometimes in new ones, always in her handwriting, her coding style, as if she were the one writing it. She started seeing the character in other parts of the game, places it wasn't supposed to be, standing in corners, watching from shadows. And at home, late at night, she'd sometimes catch her reflection in the dark screen of her laptop, and for just a moment, it would smile that cold, empty smile before returning to normal. She stopped working on the game. She requested a transfer to a different project, something safer, something that didn't involve AI or NPCs. Her request was approved, and she moved to a smaller team working on a mobile puzzle game, something light and harmless. But she never forgot what happened, and she never stopped looking over her shoulder, checking her reflections, making sure the person staring back at her was really her. The game was eventually released, Echoes of the Forgotten, and it became a surprise hit, praised for its innovative AI and the way the NPCs seemed almost alive, reacting to players in ways that felt uncanny and real. But there were complaints too. Some players reported that one of the characters, a pale woman in a blood-stained hospital gown, seemed to know too much, seemed to be watching them through the screen. There were stories of the character appearing in places it shouldn't be, of it whispering the player's real name, of it smiling that cold, empty smile. The studio dismissed the complaints as bugs or player imagination, and most people forgot about them. But Jiwon knew the truth. She knew that something had gotten into the game that night, something that had used her code, her work, to create itself. And every time she saw a screenshot or a video of that character, standing in a hallway or lurking in a corner, she felt a chill run down her spine, because she knew it was still there, still waiting, still watching, and one day it would find a way out. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.